Augustus F. Hawkins Foundation, Mr. Ryan E. Middleton, Special Assistant to the Chief of Staff of Office of Prince George's County Executive, and immediate past president of the James J. Franklin Bourne Bar Association, and also Dr. Carmen Walker, Associate Professor of Government and Department of History of Government at Bowie State University. Finally, we have one of our students, Demetrius Briscoe. Mr. Briscoe is a junior at Bowie State University, majoring in government and minoring in public policy. He's interned at Capitol Hill with Congressman Anthony Brown, Congressman Connor Lamb, and Congressman G.K. Butterfield. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us here today. The occasion today is to talk about the Constitution in general, but also we want to speak about some of the broader issues that affect society. So in general, I'd like our panelists to think about the protest movement that are going on today, and also how voting can impact issues such as police reform, and also speaking to this new generation, what impact can a college student have in the political arena, and what are the best ways for people under 30 to get involved in politics. Now, personally, even though myself and several members of the panel may want to encourage you to register to vote and participate in this upcoming election, what's most important is that we want you to participate in civic society, whether that is involving yourself in protesting, joining certain organizations, or in getting engaged with political parties. So this is the general context that we want everyone to think about today. So with that said, let me open the panel with these questions in mind. Mr. Temple, would you like to begin?
Thank you.
You're on mute.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. Today is Constitution Day, and one of the critical questions when we think about the Constitution is citizenship. And it's a term that's loosely bandied about, but what does citizenship mean? And I think that young people should really understand that citizenship did not just happen. And this document that we call the Constitution is critical to what citizenship means historically. This celebrated Constitution has two machinations, two identities, one between 1619 and 1865, and another after 1865, following a civil war, when the Congress of the United States passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Those 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were critical. And as students in particular, you have to read the 1857 Dred Scott decision, which was penned by a jurist from the state of Maryland by the name of Roger Taney. And in that decision, Justice Taney, not just focusing on Black people, but focusing on people of African descent, in particular those who were enslaved, underscored that we were chattel property. We were nothing more than cattle. You have to understand that we were not citizens. We had no rights. We couldn't go to school. There were laws called compulsory ignorance laws. We were bought and sold. Our families were separated. And for disobedience, we were beaten into submission. And there were no rights. There was no such thing as a right to vote or even a wage. And that's between 1619 and 1865. So for approximately 90,000 days, not a single person of African descent had the opportunity to participate in the system. Fast forward to 1865 and the passage of the 13th Amendment. It is critical that you understand the significance of this Constitution and these amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but the 14th Amendment defined our citizenship. And that included persons who were born or naturalized in the United States. So those 90,000 days and the millions of people that were excluded from the system by the stroke of a pen in the Constitution and the 14th Amendment were achieved citizenship rights. And those citizenship rights were meaningful. And they were certainly meaningful to people that had been excluded from the process. And they gave us the opportunity to participate in a system of governance at state, local, and federal levels where people are elected. And those people make decisions about policies and programs and finances. Keeping in mind that our governments throughout the United States, the state, local, federal, municipal governments, they spend trillions of dollars into areas of concern. Even Bowie State is Exhibit 1. Bowie State is a funded school by the state government. The state government meets and they discuss what amount of money should go to Bowie and why. And ultimately, here you have it as you sit in this audience. But they go to other considerations: housing, criminal justice, the appointment of judges and the election of judges. All these things happen in our daily lives. And unfortunately, some of us discount them. Central to this discussion, and I underscore this, is a gentleman by the name of Charles Hamilton Houston. And you must know and understand Houston, because Houston was the pioneer, not just a lawyer who participated in the litigation of equal rights and the interpretation of what this Constitution means, but also someone who understood, because in 1896, the Supreme Court came down with another decision, people, and it was said it was a separate but equal decision. Black people can be separate but equal. What a preposterous proposition. But Houston challenged that doggedly. And Charlie Houston almost single-handedly went into the South and challenged segregation and the notion of equal protection, particularly in education. And he won cases and then lost cases and took them to the United States Supreme Court, where time after time after time after time after time after time, he won decisions that would benefit not only you, but also your children and your children's children. So now we come to a period of time where we're in the 20th century. And you have to understand that Houston's work overturned Plessy in 1954 with the Brown v. Board of Education decision. So what does that really mean in terms of the notion of equal protection and equal constitutional citizenship status? It means that we have only enjoyed over the 1619 to 2020 period, 401 years, approximately 46 and 20, 66 years of citizenship. And what we do with that citizenship matters. There's no such thing as I'm not going to vote, because if you don't vote, you're implicitly voting. Very quickly, and I'm not going to be much longer, and I'm sensitive to my time, there's 10 votes. 3 people say they're not going to vote. That means there's 7 people voting left. The decision, ultimately, whatever people are voting on, is seven persons, is 4-3. That means that the 3 people who didn't vote affected the ultimate decision by way of a negative implication. But more importantly, the vote is critical because we're not just talking in a vacuum, but we're talking about values that Charles Houston respected and understood would affect our lives, whether it's equal protection, whether it's due process, but certainly the opportunity to vote and participate in a government that affects our lives for generations and generations and generations and generations to come. Houston was not short-sighted. Houston viewed the question of voting with vision in a bold, brave way, the way that you're taught and the way that our students are taught at historically Black colleges, to rise to another level of consciousness and to understand what public accountability means and how the governments are used, not only for governmental reasons, but on the private side of the equation, so that we can build a sustained life and to ensure our empowerment as we graduate from an emancipation context. I'm going to close by saying this, is that citizenship matters. Citizenship matters. The fact that you wake up in the morning, you can say, I am a citizen, means something. But you also have to understand it matters so much that people want to take that citizenship away from you. When you hear that they're attempting to suppress the vote, they want to take your citizenship away from you. They want to take it away from you for a reason, because they know what it means when you are participating in a system and your numbers mean something. And I'll close by saying this, is that don't take it for granted. People took it for granted in 1939 in Germany. They went to sleep. And when they woke up, Adolf Hitler was changing the world because they thought it couldn't happen. And at the Holocaust Museum here in downtown DC, there's a sign, and you should pen it in your book, and you should be mindful of it. If it happened, it can happen again. So this vote, this time, where we are, 2020, is significant. But more importantly, on Constitution Day, don't you ever forget that your citizenship matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Temple. I want to get some feedback from Mr. Middleton as well, but before then, I'd like to get some non-legal opinions on that by bringing in Ms. Gardner and then Mr. Briscoe to comment on this, have some ideas.
Thank you for the invitation to speak today. I am not an attorney, but I echo the sentiment and the passion behind Mr. Temple's comments. So I'm Levita Gardner, former BSU student, but I'm going to speak to you today from the perspective of an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur being someone who charts their path, who identifies where there's a problem, creates a solution. So I want you to take away from this conversation, for that reason, ways that you are able to directly impact what's happening today. And one of the most important pieces, like my colleague before me mentioned, the Constitution. We're celebrating Constitution Day. There's a lot of conversation about how do we affect change? How do we dismantle? How do we adjust and shift and make this system work for us? But it's one important thing to know is that in order to change a system, you have to understand the system in place and understand the rules that govern it. At the bottom of that is the Constitution and the continued revision of that Constitution and how it's adjusted. Understanding that the Constitution is a living and breathing document that is still open to change. So identifying what's here today, but also identifying what can be. In order to identify what can be, we have to understand what's there now. Also to engage, I want to make sure that everybody is ready to engage. There is a role for everyone. Everyone's not an attorney, everyone's not a business owner. So there's a role for the activist, the advocate, the protester, the poll worker, the business owner, and the politician. But the most important person in that is the voter. As Mr. Temple mentioned, by not participating in the process, you are effectively participating in it, because you're adjusting the way that vote will occur. So I want to encourage everyone to be engaged. If you are not already registered to vote, register to vote. If you're registered to vote, I want you to look around you and identify the people in your family or your sphere of influence and encourage them to get registered to vote. We always want to look how we can go outside of ourselves to impact change, but sometimes that change that we need to impact is directly in front of us. They're the people that are connected to us, that sphere of influence that you have on your social networks, within your family, within your households or dorms, and get people engaged and ready to participate in this process. And encourage everyone, if they don't already have a copy, to pick up a copy and have that Constitution available, because a lot of the conversation that's happening today, to better understand it, all of the information you need is in that document. Then if you are not already, because we are talking about registering to vote, consider participating in the election in our democratic process as a poll worker. Generally, what we see at the polls are constituencies that are running it are much older than us. Because of the situation we're in with COVID-19, we want to make sure we're able to protect our democratic values and protect our ability to vote. And it's going to take us putting ourselves out there with our masks as safely as we can to make sure that we're able to affect that change. I've already registered to be an election judge. I hope you guys will join me in going to the Maryland Board of Elections, or if you're watching from somewhere else, the Board of Elections in your state, so that you can register to participate on election day, or let's consider election season, because election day is no longer just one day in many places. You will be able to vote for up to a week prior to November 3rd. Then tell everyone that you know to go to vote.org or Vote 411 to check on their voting status and learn their voting options. This is a national website. Everyone can get involved. And if you haven't already, the underpinning of the Constitution is the census. Everybody is concerned about the census. They say, I don't want people to know my business. I don't want people to know all the details about me. The census asks very simple questions that most of us have already put on the internet already. It's on Facebook, right? But it's really, really important because it identifies not only apportionment, but also where funding goes that's appropriated through Congress for the next 10 years. So make sure that you're participating in the process, make sure you're completing your census, and make sure that you're engaged. And while you're getting engaged, make sure you bring as many people with you to bring them into this process as well. I'm not going to take up too much time because I want to be here to answer any questions. But these are entrepreneurial ways that we can all just get things done, that we can change the situation that we're in right now. And that's by getting involved, taking your own leadership abilities, getting engaged, getting involved, and then bringing more people with you. Thank you for the time. I'll turn my time back over to my next panelist.
Thank you. Mr. Briscoe, would you like to? I think you're on mute. Would you like to add something, Mr. Briscoe? I can't hear you.
Sorry, it wouldn't let me unmute. I was trying to unmute for the longest time. Thank you for having me. I'm a student at Bowie State University at the moment. I'm a junior. I'm Gen Z, so my perspective on the vote, my perspective on the Constitution, my perspective on the United States government is a little different from the other panelists. It may not be, but in my opinion, it is. I think the vote is very important. Let me first say that the vote is super important. But I think something that is just as American as the vote is protest. I think protest could be more American because that is what got us to where we are today, right? The Revolutionary War, American Revolution, Christopher addicts, protesting towards British soldiers dying because he wanted to make sure that he lived in a country where he didn't feel oppressed and downtrodden by the British government. I think protest is so American that women had to fight for the right to vote. In the streets, marching. Black people had to march for civil rights, the right to vote. So protesting is major, and I think we are in a time where we see the vote. My generation sees the vote as something that is valuable but not doing enough. And protest is valuable, but it's not doing enough. I think we have to start to organize ourselves to run for office, get into these positions where we can make change for our future, right? The Black Lives Matter movement, in my opinion, is as closely related to the Civil Rights March, the LGBT movement in the 70s, the women's vote movement, women's rights movement in the 20s. I think it's just as important then it is now, right? And so when we say vote, 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 yes, that's important because that is the way that you have most access to power, right? But also go out in the streets to make your voice heard, because that's the only way we're going to live in a system that values our lives. I think when it comes to my generation, we see an America that's slightly different than those of our parents and our grandparents. We see an America where our elected officials are working for us in a way that when we ask for clean air, it shouldn't be a discussion on how we get clean air, right? We know how we can get there. We know what we need to do. There's things that are plaguing our country when it comes to race and climate change and inequality when it comes to wealth. And so we're at this moment, we're saying we voted for so long, we're voting, but no one is hearing our voice. So we're out in the streets, we're protesting for Black lives. And people say, oh, that's just about police brutality. It's more than police brutality. Black Lives Matter movement is about Black women not dying from giving birth anymore, right? Black children not dying from being malnourished. Black children having the best education that they have. And yes, voting can get us there, but there needs to be a movement on the ground that is calling for these changes to happen. That's the only way change really happened in this country, when people are out on the ground moving to push us to a right direction. So the vote is very important. Getting involved, doing the census, volunteering at your polling place, but being on the ground, petitioning your government, calling your representative, knocking on their door in that office on Capitol Hill, that is what is super important as well. Not just voting, but actually always being engaged in city action. So that's just all I have to say for it.
Thank you. First, I'd like to ask Dr. Carmen Walker to do a follow-up, and then I'm gonna ask Mr. Middleton to also offer some perspective on this issue. Dr. Walker.
Yes, good morning. How are you? Uh, Thank you, Dr. Robertson. Just to sort of pull together what has already been said, and I thank Mr. Briscoe for his comments, and Mr. Templeton and Ms. Gardner for their comments as well. Certainly when we talk about the Constitution and Constitution Day, we are talking about the importance of citizenship and being recognized by the state. And when Mr. Templeton really put this 400 years into perspective and thinking about the fact that our active citizenship and the ability to be recognized, and that recognition is still being tested today, but 60 years, that's really sobering. But recognizing the importance of citizenship, and really at this particular moment in this presidential election year, the importance of your vote and getting out to vote, and not just, we know the symbolic and emotional reasons why we need to vote, but we also know that there are real policy implications for voting. We know that our vote makes a difference in terms of who's in office and who's nominating and putting federal judges in office as well. And so that citizenship becomes important, that conversation there. But also, pulling together, continuing with what Ms. Gardner reminds us of, and I really appreciate this importance placed on engagement, and not just getting out to vote, but also recognizing that there's power in the social networks that we are in, and the different organizations, the civic organizations, political organizations, church affiliates, all of these spaces where we touch family and friends, and we have the opportunity to not only encourage voting, but also talk about those issues that are important to this particular election, and even beyond. And then just sort of pulling in what Demetrius, what Mr. Briscoe has reminded us of, and this is something that I'm hearing, I continue to hear in the classrooms and with students in their research projects. The millennial generation, Generation Z, the issues move beyond, yes, police brutality is important, but this issue, the issue of healthcare, the issue of food insecurity, the issues, related to education and equity. These are things that are shaping the young voters who we need to get out to vote, because we know there's historically this challenge of getting young people not only register, we get the excitement around the registration, but also getting them to vote. And what Demetrius is reminding us of is something that I really push. The vote is important, but the vote alone is not enough. We talk about, we need to support that vote with meetings, if you want to take it to the streets, there's a place for protest as well. But contacting and communicating and working with those who are elected to represent our policy interests. So, I definitely appreciate Demetrius and Mr. Briscoe, highlighting all of those things. But this vote, yes, as everyone has, is saying, and what we'll continue to hear, this 2020 election is important. And let's just not talk about the 2020 election. We need to talk about midterm. We need to talk about the state and local elections, because those state and local officials touch us even more. So, I would argue even more so than the national government. So I'm going to stop here. I'll stop here. And I certainly want to add a little bit more later as we talk about the impact of of some of the things that are happening around the country as it relates to, the issue of voter suppression. Mr. Temple reminded us, that yes, there's a reason that it is clearly understood that that vote is important. And so it's not by coincidence that you see the issues of, clearing the voter rolls, the issues of voter ID, many different tactics that are emerging now to attempt to discourage voter participation. But I hope we get a chance to talk about some of these efforts, the issues that are happening in Florida, Wisconsin, and around the country as well. Thank you, Dr. Robertson, for this moment.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. Mr. Middleton, would you like to weigh in on any thoughts on these issues? Mr. Middleton, I don't know. I think he's not. I
I'm
think
good
you
now.
should be unmuted now. Okay. You muted yourself again.
There we go. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. Thank you, Dr. Robertson, and thank you, Dr. Bro and Lisa Ransom from the Augustus Hawkins Foundation for inviting me here to speak today. Last year during Constitution Day, I was able to speak to a bunch of middle schoolers at some Prince George's County public schools about the importance of voting. Last year, I was able to compare, really play the game that we just played, that exercise of if 10 people have the vote and 3 people don't, we're able to play that. And if the middle schools were able to get it, I think everyone else should be able to as well. I want to talk about the government's responsibility to its citizens regarding the social contract. We pay our taxes to the government to make sure that we have things like our school systems, our roads, our bridges, fire departments. When we're driving over a bridge, we don't have really worry about it crumbling down when we're on it. If our house catches on fire, we really don't have to worry about getting a bill as soon as the fire department puts it out. And it's because we have these things that we really don't need to think about, that the flip side to that coin is the government and the social contract calls upon us to be constantly engaged in making sure that we have this thing that we call an experiment in democracy. And please rest assured that this thing we have in the United States of America, it does not need to exist. It can go away. There was at one point, not long ago, it didn't exist at all. And we've seen things like Donald Trump just yesterday justify his response to the coronavirus by basically discounting the deaths, COVID-19 deaths that happened in what he deemed blue states. So it's very important that we're constantly engaged at every level of our government. Now, voting does matter, but I'd like to follow up to Mr. Briscoe's comment about protest and staying constantly engaged. Voting is just one part of it. When you go and you state your opinion on who you want to be in office, that is just the first part. That's just the beginning of where we start when we have our democracy. It also requires us to attend legislative hearings. It requires us to testify. It requires us to write letters. It requires us to make phone calls. It requires us to protest. It requires us to, if we see our elected officials in public, that we go introduce ourselves, that we let them know who we are, what our problems are, so they can be abreast of the issues that are affecting their constituents. That's part of it. It's a constant thing. So when people suggest that, well, I voted and that's all I have to do, no, we have to keep it up. We have to stay on them, because the people that we send into these leadership positions, into office, these people have interests, and they're going to follow those interests as you would follow yours. So once they get into the office, they're going to have the interest of staying there. And if they're more beholden to people who are giving them campaign donations, then they're going to follow those interests, because they really don't have to worry about the voters, because the voters think that their job starts and ends with going to the ballot box. So it's incumbent upon all of us to remain engaged, to know who these people are, first off. Anytime I've ever heard someone say government doesn't work, or they've complained about a pothole, or whatever other problem that they may be dealing with in their community, first thing I ask them is, well, who are your elected officials? Do you know who your county council member is? Do you know who the mayor of your town is? Do you know who your state delegate or state senator? Do you know who your United States House of Representatives are? Do you know who your US senators are? And 9 times out of 10, the people don't know them. They may name someone who once was in that position, but has long since moved on. And that is important. Just knowing who they are and knowing what their activities is a measure of social engagement that you need to abide by. Now, a lot of times during these, especially during presidential elections, you hear people say that they're not inspired by the candidates. That's good. It's good not to be inspired by the candidate. And the reason why is because once you vote for one of them, because you have to vote for one of them or you're not gonna make your voice heard, it becomes a business transaction. So if I vote for candidate X and I'm not inspired by them, I expect them to fulfill some of the campaign promises that they made, and I'm not going to be wooed by any fancy rhetoric that they may want to spring on me later on. So it's actually good. Don't be inspired, because right now it's now becomes a transactional thing. And speaking to Levita's concepts of economics and entrepreneurship, if you buy a stock and that's a business transaction, you're not gonna just like buy the stock and just leave it alone. You're gonna monitor it, right? You're gonna make sure that you get a return on that investment. The same thing should apply here. The person that we elect to the presidency, or the people that we elect to Congress, the people that we elect to our local and state offices, those are business transactions that they're conducting with us. They're not doing us favors. They're business transactions, and they need to be treated as such. So we need to look at them and elect the people who are most likely going to do the things that we want them to do. And that's all we need them to do. We don't need to be wooed by fancy rhetoric, because that part is over now. We are in very dangerous times, and to not participate in this process, as you've seen, could mean life or death for many of us. So look after your investment when you vote. Stay in constant contact with the people you put in office, and make sure that they are putting in the right judges. Make sure that you're voting for the right state's attorneys. Make sure that you are that they are putting people in the right agencies who are actually looking out for you and your family's best interests. And keep it to that, because that's the long and short of it. It's a business transaction. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're going to move on into a Q&A session because time is starting to run short. I just briefly want to mention one of the key questions, particularly with Black politics, is this issue, particularly in the 60s and the 70s, and how we move from protest to politics. Also, and this is in response to what Mr. Briscoe said, that SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Community, had a grassroots model. A lot of people are familiar that Congressman John Lewis passed last month, and he was a member of SNCC. And he went on to run for Congress. So I just want to mention that there are several activists. Another example was Congressman Bobby Rush in Illinois, who was a part of the Black Panther Party in Illinois. So I just want to emphasize, just because you're activists in the community, you can also get engaged in systemic politics. So you participating in protest movements and being on the ground does not exclude you from later on in life engaging in some of the formal systemic aspects of politics. So with that said, let's move into the Q&A. One of the questions that was mentioned is, can our panelists speak to some of the formal mechanisms, the Electoral College, and how we're going to protect this election in terms of this current administration and everyone's right to vote? So in terms of obstacles or barriers that we need to be wary of, and how can we protect our vote? So just speaking to some of the challenges in this current environment with this upcoming election. So anyone in the panelists can go first.
Well, I guess since it's silent, I'll say something, but it's a good question, because the way the system is actually structured, the people elect electorates who then elect the president. Each state has a number of electorates that's consistent with the numbers of elected officials and the population of the states. We should key into that because it's a question that students, really you students, should be thinking about and knowing about. You should be reading, and I teach, and so I encourage my students to read like it's nothing greater that you can do, and to think and to look under the rock that's under the rock that's under the rock. And the Electoral College is one of those rocks, because it is, and we've seen it in the last election. It's right here in front of our face, and we see it again now. In this particular election, we should know, people talk about Donald Trump and his constituents, et cetera, but we're kind of in a civil war, a value civil war in the United States. There are quote unquote red states and blue states. But what are those values? What are our values? And how does it play out? In this particular election, there's probably 7 or 8 states that really matter in terms of the Electoral College. And some of them. Florida is one of them, Virginia is another one, Pennsylvania, Ohio, et cetera. And so as we look at those states, what's critical for us in terms of informing the outcome of this election is that we get people out to vote in those states. So a presidential candidate here this year could win the popular vote and lose the Electoral College vote. That's a given. So our activism, and I wanted to piggyback with something, because voting and something you said, Demetrius, voting is one thing, but it is a component of citizenship. And I'm going to go back to the Constitution because it's Constitution Day, but then it goes back to the First Amendment to the Constitution and what it means. And part of that citizenship enables us to, as you say, Demetrius, we've been protesting since we got we were placed on boats coming across the Middle Passage. And the list of people that protest is endless. And so that's a critical component of that. The real underlying question is for the students is one of public accountability. What are your values and what are people giving you, and are they being accountable? If they're elected as a dog catcher, it doesn't matter to the president of the United States. And our challenge in terms of expressing our citizenship is to have some formula, some criteria, some values framework where we are able to measure what we want and to demand, as Ryan said, accountability, because that's how people get power. Sitting back and watching it on TV is something that should almost, citizenship should almost be a way of life, because it's not about us. It's about our families, our parents, our grandparents, about our children, our grandchildren. And it affects everything that we do, from when you wake up in the morning and you come to this stoplight at the intersection, or when you're born and you get that birth certificate, to when you die and you get that death certificate. So it's something that affects us, and we have to do everything we can to keep the Constitution expansive and the law expansive to protect our rights.
And I just add into there, because we just, Mr. Temple just mentioned the rock under the rock under the rock, and the underpinning of the Electoral College, which is based on the amount of representatives that we have in Congress, which is based on the 2020, which is based on the census. And so when we're talking about citizenship and active participation in it, this is one of those tools that have been used that largely in part a number of our communities don't participate in, and that the nonpartisan, that the current administration has set up ways that to suppress your participation in the census by shortening the time period, right? By making it almost difficult for you to understand what you're supposed to do. So it's one of those things that underpins everything that's in our Constitution. It underpins the Electoral College and our representation in Congress and the funding that goes into our schools to have the resources for every program that Mr. Briscoe spoke about, for instance, the malnutrition, having the appropriate doctors, knowing where people are and where to send those resources, because we're paying taxes every day based on who's working, not based on who completes the census, right? So there is a way that there is an unevenness in that, but the census is what's underpinning all of our resources that are coming back, our representation in Congress and our representation in that Electoral College.
I can actually speak on that real fast. I think when it comes to the Electoral College or the systems that make up the electoral system, right? The Electoral College is unfair. I believe why is certain states in the Midwest who don't necessarily put more into the government or into the country that they do take out. I feel like that is unfair. I think when it comes to places like New York, where Black and brown people are working and working and working and working, places like California, places like Washington, D.C., places where Black and brown people, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, where Black and brown people are literally holding up this country, right? The census is one thing. Census is important that we all fill out the census because that's the current system that we're in. So like we have to reimagine a world, in my opinion, where we don't count people based off of like making sure they get water or food or like good education, when we know that this is what they need. We know that these people are suffering. We know that how many people live in these neighborhoods, but because they don't fill out the census, we don't give them the things that they really need, because they're like, oh, they didn't fill it out. So we know there's this X, Y, and Z people there, but because they didn't fill out a piece of paper or a document to tell us that they're there, we're gonna ignore them and remove ourselves from actually investing in their lives. And that is what I think my generation is trying to make a statement on, is we want to create a world. I said this yesterday. I want to be the ancestor that my descendants would need, right? We don't want to keep making the systems that have always kept us down to like work them and figure them out and try to work inside of them, when we can say, how can we envision an America where everyone is being taken care of, right? And yes, we have to work in the census, we have to do the Electoral College because that's the system that we have now. But how can we get into positions of power? Because it's all about power. Who has what? Who has the ability to make sure that you have this, you have that, they have what they need, right? And if we can actually envision a world where I, who grew up in privilege in Prince George's County on the outside of the Beltway, which is different from the inside of the Beltway, how can I, with my privilege, make sure that those people inside the Beltway are being taken care of, the most marginalized, the most oppressed? And I see that these systems like the Electoral College and the census and certain electoral politics or politics in general is not helping those people, because I feel like it's all about us. Oh, they don't fill that out, they're being ignored. And we have to re-envision that. So yes, right now, fill out the census. Right now, we have to get people out to vote for the Electoral College. But we also have to start to re-envision America where things can be sustainable. And that's just where I have on that. I think Electoral College is important, census is important for today, but tomorrow we have to think of something else.
If I could just say something to Demetrius, I think you hit a nail on the head. It goes back to Booker T. Washington and Du Bois and the notion of political democracy and what I call economic democracy. We should not put all of our eggs in the government's basket as a people. And there have been people that have striven, Marcus Garvey and the Nation of Islam and others that have striven for self-sufficiency and self-determination, but it's still citizenship that gives us the opportunity to empower ourselves even economically. Right. And so when we think, we shouldn't just think, well, the government. We should say the government's responsible as part of that equation. But we ourselves as a community throughout the country, and as I said yesterday, throughout the African diaspora, we have tremendous opportunities, and American citizenship empowers us in that diaspora to do things that young people had to think about. The people you're listening to now have seen struggle, but you young people have the opportunity to learn, to read. It used to be against the law to teach Black people to read. So you're there at Bowie State and you have the opportunity. You should be hungry. There are 168 hours in a week. You should take that time, not waste that time, and realize this is a prime time of your life to empower yourselves. So I appreciate what you're saying, and know that this continuum is a broad continuum for us. It's government plus. It's us plus government. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I want to make sure, since time is getting short, we get the Mr. Middleton and Dr. Walker to offer some closing thoughts, and after that, we'd like to ask Ms. Ransom to add some closing commentary as well. So, Mr. Middleton or Dr. Walker, would you like to add some closing thoughts?
Okay. Yes, just in terms of closing thoughts, and keeping and just reflecting on the Constitution, and all of this from, Demetrius' emphasis on protest, and just listening to everyone, and the emphasis on engagement and understanding the importance of citizenship. I can only think about the fact that our Constitution, yes, this Constitution that we are recognizing today is one that is capable of stretching and expanding to address, the needs and, the needs of today, our policy needs, the recognizing the issues that African Americans and people of color, everyone in this country, the Constitution is capable of expanding to address the new needs. Okay, old needs, new needs, and expanding to embrace everyone. But it's going to take engagement. It takes engagement from everyone, engagement in the voting booth, engagement on the ground, engagement, as Ryan Middleton said earlier, connecting in the legislative halls and offices, and connecting with our representatives, recognizing and engaging in the courtrooms, in all of these spaces to force that Constitution. It won't expand and grow and address the needs on its own. It takes all of us to force that change. And that's really what I would like to add here.
Thank you. Mr. Middleton?
I'll just conclude by saying, please stay engaged. Please fill out your census. Please vote. Please vote safely. Get your mail-in ballot. You can apply for it online right after this, and they should be being sent out by I think early next month. So please get your mail-in ballot. Please be safe. Please stay constantly engaged. It's actually, given our new normal, it's actually never been easier to connect with and attend our legislative hearings or legislative sessions, connect with our elected leaders, because everything's on Zoom now. So you can do it all from the comfort of your living room. So please go on their websites, follow them on social media, stay engaged with them, ask questions, and be safe.
Dr.
Thank
Roberts?
you.
Dr. Robertson?
Yes, go ahead, Dr.
I was just going to say, the registration deadlines for Maryland, October 13th for registration, voter registration deadlines, and early voting. The early voting period begins October 26th through November 2nd. And for mail-in ballots, if we're doing mail-in ballots, we certainly want to encourage those to be in, or at least postmarked by November 3rd.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Before we close, I'd like to turn the floor over to Ms. Lisa Ransom, who played a critical role in organizing this panel today. So Ms. Ransom, would you like to offer some words before we conclude this session today?
Thank you, Dr. Robertson. I so appreciate it. On behalf of the Augustus F. Hawkins Foundation and my board colleagues, Dr. Irene Ricks and Ms. Levita Gardner, that are both here today, I want to thank Bowie State for its leadership. I'd like to thank Dr. Bro and you, Dr. Robertson, and Dr. Walker. I want to commend this distinguished panel for their insight, their guidance, and their ability and willingness to move the needle on this issue of exercising our rights of citizenship, the vote, and understanding the electoral process. We welcome at the Hawkins Foundation the opportunity to support platforms that engage, encourage, and empower communities. That is a significant part of our goal. We are a 501c3 nonprofit public foundation and think tank, and our principles are focused on education and workforce and advocacy. And so we relish this opportunity to partner with Bowie State University, not just in this initiative, but in an upcoming initiative that you will hear more about that I will share just a bit. It's called Teach Us About Us, Teach Us About Us. And it's focused on civic education for non-political scientists. So the very topics that we are discussing today will be the focus of a broader curriculum in partnership with Bowie State and other academic partners. We look forward to being able to, as I said, move the needle. And you'll hear there's a new campaign out that for Gen Z that really is all about you got next or we got next. So knowing that you have next, we want you to be knowledgeable, strategic, and prepared. And our goal is to provide that support system and Teach Us About Us. So again, thank you, Dr. Bro. Thank you, Dr. Robertson. Thank you, Dr. Walker. Thank you, Professor Temple, extraordinaire, civil rights extraordinaire, Ryan Middleton, Levita Gardner, and our student leader, Demetrius Briscoe, who was so forthcoming in sharing a next-gen perspective. Thank you for this opportunity. We look forward to the next steps.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Ransom. With that said, I'd like to echo everything and thank all of our panelists today. So on behalf of Bowie State University, Department of History and Government, Hawkins Foundation, and everyone else, thank you. And we look forward to continuing this conversation in the future. Have a good day.